Hello, welcome to .NET Community Stand-Up Cloud Style. In this case, we're going to talk about sort of cloud and web-related tools. Very excited. This is our first one.
Yep. A little bit nervous, but it's all good.
Yeah. So my name is Andrew Hall. I'm a program manager lead on our web and Azure tools in Visual Studio, and I brought with me today.
My name is Angelos Petropoulos. I'm also a PM on .NET, and I do a lot with web and Azure tooling.
Great. So tell me a little bit about kind of what are some of the specific technologies you work on in your day job, Angelos?
Specific technologies. So my team is responsible for publish in Visual Studio. So once you have your application building and working to an acceptable level, and you feel you want to see what it looks like once you have it deployed to an environment that just isn't your F5. It could be a local IaaS server. It could be a remote IaaS server. It could be Azure. It could even be other hosts and other clouds. Visual Studio has the publish platform that lets you quickly get your code with the right configuration where you want it. I also own the file new project creation when it comes to ASP.NET and cloud projects. So I also work with templates, and my team also owns the .NET new from the .NET Core CLI.
Very cool. A lot of cool stuff.
Excited.
So that may be a little preview of some of the stuff we plan on talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
So I work in the same team as Angelos, so just a little bit broader. So we tend to, my team more broadly owns all of the tools that ship out of the .NET organization. That includes all of our web editors. It includes the .NET CLI and .NET SDK, all the productivity features that ship in Visual Studio, refactorings, code fixes, things like that. But today we're going to focus more on the cloud side specifically, but we'll also show some fun new stuff that is coming for web developers in general, especially ASP.NET. As a first place to start, I thought we'd just start with a couple fun blog posts I found from community members, and we can maybe discuss those for a little bit.
Let's do it.
And so if I can switch to the right screen. There we go. So this is a blog post that I found talking about ASP.NET Core plus Azure Key Vault plus Azure AD MSI, and it says awesome way to do config. So as a starting point, when we talk about the cloud, right, obviously inside Microsoft we think about Azure. And when we think about Azure, we generally tell people, hey, the place that you want to look to start is Azure App Service. And so in this blog post, he goes through and he's talking about ways to do configuration and really secrets. So one of the things that not everybody may have heard or dealt with is, I think the two things here would be Key Vault and MSI. So can you first of all explain to me a little bit, just what is Key Vault? Why would I want to use it in my ASP.NET application? Yeah.
So this is an old problem, and Key Vault and Azure AD MSI are a cloud solution to this old problem. Back in the day when I used to write WinForms applications connecting to SQL Server, we started off with connection strings that had username and passwords in there. Then we started encrypting them. Then we thought, well, what if the service is running as a Windows identity, and then you give the Windows identity the permissions, and then your connection string doesn't have to have any secrets, and it was great. So in a cloud world, in a cloud environment, your application needs to talk to various services, various data stores, and just like in the old days, you need to authenticate. You can't let just anybody connect to your services and anybody read your data. So the first step towards making sure that your secrets are at least outside of your code base is Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault is an Azure service that allows you to store application secrets. They can be things like I said, connection strings to a database. They can be API keys to another service like Google or Facebook for authentication. It can be anything really that you consider important enough to protect it. Especially with open source and the tendency for pretty much everybody to have their code open for everybody to see, you want to protect against accidentally also checking in a secret that eventually makes it to a public repo, and all of a sudden you've kind of created a problem out of nothing. So the first step of defense is having a place where you can centrally store your secrets, and then you only have one place where you can go get your secrets, and it's not in your source code. So that's what Key Vault does. But that doesn't actually solve the problem 100%, because you still have to authenticate with Key Vault itself.
Hold on, one quick question. So yeah, we'll get there. It's a good question. So obviously in ASP.NET Core, we introduced secrets.json a long time ago. Yeah. And then more recently in ASP.NET, we introduced secrets.xml. So what would the advantage from a developer perspective be potentially using Key Vault rather than using secrets.xml or secrets.json.
Yeah. You're stealing my little example I had for later on for environments, but we'll talk about it twice. So not twice, but people will know what I'm talking about. So because Key Vault is an Azure service, some people might be fine using that even when you're in a local environment and you're F5ing. Some people have no issue with an internet connection, and they don't mind that their F5 is kind of relying on something that is outside of their local machine. But the majority don't. I know personally I don't like my F5 being slow. I don't like my F5 being kind of relying on an internet connection. Sometimes I'm working on the train or the plane. So the philosophy usually is your local debugging in your F5 should always have local dependencies. So if you still want to make sure your secrets are not in your source code, and you don't want to take a dependency to something like Azure Key Vault, that's why ASP.NET Core, and now also ASP.NET, has the ability to store secrets in a JSON or XML file. It depends on the technology stack. But the sweet stuff is that it's in a location on your machine that is outside of your repo. But the project system is smart enough to be able to read from them. And the magic is the runtime. The magic is that the runtime lets you write one line of code that accesses your secret, no matter where your secret is actually stored. And then via runtime configuration, you can tell your application where to go look. So just by having a user secrets.json existing, there is an order of precedence in the framework, in the runtime, that tells it when that is there, you probably want values from there first.
But so I think one of the things I heard you say, it may have been implicit, but is the nice thing about secrets.json or secrets.xml is everything's on my local machine.
Yep.
But the downside of that is everything's on my local machine outside source control. So if I like to work across multiple machines, or I want to work across my team, I now have to figure out a somewhat secure way of getting those things across my multiple machines. If I set up a new machine, like I work in virtual machines in the cloud, every time I'm going to have to go get those configuration values from somewhere and paste them into my secrets.json, secret.xml file on that local machine. Where the really nice thing that Key Vault could enable, if I don't mind a cloud connection as part of my F5, is I could set up, let's say we have some API keys that we use for third-party services. I could have a team Key Vault that all of us had permission to access, and then no matter who's using it, no matter what machine I'm on, it just always magically works. That's
right. So user secrets and user XML probably gets you through the local environment, but as soon as you want to share the environment or you want to reuse the environment, Key Vault starts making a lot of sense.
Perfect. All right, so I think I interrupted you a little bit, but you mentioned that so the last problem is not wanting secrets on my machine.
Right.
And Azure AD MSI helps me solve that.
Right. So we said we don't want to have any username and passwords, so we're going to put them in Key Vault, but how do you access Key Vault? You need the username and password, right? Well, you don't really. So this is where Azure MSI comes in, which is Microsoft Identity on Azure that runs on top of Azure AD. The idea is that an Azure service and an Azure application has an identity inside Microsoft Azure AD that is fully managed. You don't have to create it, it just exists. So then all you have to do is grant it permissions to the storage accounts, the SQL accounts, whatever other service you want it to access. So the classic enterprise pattern is that your application uses MSI to access Key Vault, and then Key Vault contains whatever secrets you want. They're either related to .NET or even for third-party services.
And so that means then when I'm locally in my machine, because I'm authenticated as a Azure user and I have access to Key Vault, then that means that when I just hit F5 to run my application locally, it automatically passes through my credentials from that machine and lets me connect without the need to check any connection information into source control.
Right, and there's something similar for when you're in production, of course. Yeah, that's right.
Great. And then once any benefits of Key Vault from a production model perspective?
Benefits of Key Vault production. So I guess we can talk about the worst case scenario if your application is compromised or anything like that. Like we said, if your source code gets leaked, things like that, we said you're kind of protecting from a unfortunate event kind of by default before it happens. A best pattern for using Key Vault in production is because Key Vault is a service, every service has a bit of latency, every service requires a request and a response, whereas accessing a local resource is usually instant. So if you take that into consideration, a good enterprise pattern for using Key Vault is when your application starts up, you access the information that you need, you get the secrets from Key Vault, and then you encrypt them and store them in memory for however long you need them, and maybe you go back and you refresh whenever you need to refresh. But the pattern is to not always hit Key Vault directly, but cast some of the credentials. Or another pattern is to store a secret in Key Vault that you then decrypt on the client side.
Okay, we had a question come in on our chat, and the question was, can you use Azure Key Vault without hosting in Azure? And the answer is yes, depending on what your definition of hosting in Azure is. So the Key Vault itself is always going to exist on Azure, but the application can be running anywhere.
Yes.
To Angelos's point, like there's different ways of authenticating against Key Vault, and so if you're not running in Azure, MSI that we were talking about that doesn't require any secrets at all to do the authentication may not work for you, but you can do certificate-based authentication or API key-based authentication. So you could be running an application locally on premises, but then actually choose to host all of your secrets in the cloud. And as Angelos mentioned, another somewhat common pattern that people do is they will actually have the secrets or connection information in an encrypted file with their actual application, and they'll store the certificate to do the encryption and decryption in Key Vault. And so what you do is you just hold the certificate in memory and you decrypt the information you need on the local machine, but instead of retrieving all the information from your Key Vault.
It's kind of unlikely, but you could even have a desktop application using Key Vault. Nothing stopping you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a not necessarily the most secure thing in the world to talk to resources directly from a desktop application, but it would be far more secure if you want to do that to retrieve the connection information, the secrets from a Key Vault, rather than just having them hard-coded and deployed with the application.
And just to geek out a little bit, Key Vault also supports the idea of versioning. So I know that it's not for everybody, but if you had a configuration value and you needed to support multiple application versions, you could even ask it for a specific version. So you can say, what is this value when my application is this version versus when my application is a different version. So it has some cool features on top of that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So move on to one more cloud technology. And this is a blog post that I found just from a member of the community that was really fun. And we'll kind of walk through and talk about it a little bit. But it says dependency injection for Azure Functions v2. So before we get into dependency injections, if anybody is not familiar, can you tell me a little bit about what are Azure Functions?
Again, I think this is a classic old problem, but with a cloud solution. So whenever we write applications, after they get a certain size and a certain maturity, we need to do things like run scheduled tasks that maybe they go and run a piece of code or they clean up something. Maybe we want to go and aggregate some data and put it in a data mart. Maybe we want to react to an event. Maybe some partner giving us some data or a user doing something or some file or some binary being uploaded somewhere. We want to react to an event rather than always be running code. So back in the day, if you were on Windows, you could use a Windows service to do things like that. In the Linux world, they're called daemons. So in the cloud, you could have an app service, you deploy an application and have a piece of code that maybe pulls at something, and then when it's the right time, it works. But there's something out of the box that Azure gives you natively that does a better job at that, which is called Azure Functions. So the idea is if you need to work with reacting to an event like an HTTP request or a message being put on the service bus, then Azure has triggers, specialized triggers for these specific Azure services that then says, well, that event just happened. Do you have some code that you want to run? And the beauty of functions is that it doesn't have to be a big, entire, huge application. It can be literally a function. And a classic scenario we see that is, let's say you have a website and a customer uploads an image and you want to watermark the image or you want to process the image. That's a classic scenario where you can have a storage account where as soon as you see an image being placed in, there's an Azure function that gets triggered because of the event being that the storage account has received a new item. Then you react to it, you get done processing the image, then you're done and your Azure function just shuts down.
I think one of the cool things, one of the terms that we use a lot for that type of technology is called serverless.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit of a misnomer.
Yeah.
While I was looking around for some fun blog posts from the community, I found one blog post. I didn't choose to show it, but they said, I just wrote the word serverless servers. What's happening to the world? And it doesn't mean that there are no servers running code. Of course, there's a server in the cloud running your code. But it's the idea that unlike, like you mentioned, app service, and we just talked about it briefly a minute ago, that's the idea of I reserve resources on a server, and I'm paying for those reserved resources at whatever, however many dollars per month. And if I want to reserve more resources, because my application scales up and scales down, then I have to reserve, it's effectively a virtual VM. It's a virtual machine in the cloud, right?
That's right.
I think it's a term we invented, but we like it. But that's what it really is. It spins up a machine, you have it, it obviously can go away. I mean, it's the cloud, it can come and go, but you're paying for the amount of resources that so if you want 2 gigs for your thing, well, you're going to pay for 2 gigs and 2 cores the entire time that it's up, whether it's actually serving requests or not. Functions are really cool because the idea behind serverless is the platform decides when to scale it up, when to scale it down, how many instances to run, and you only pay, kind of as you talked about, it's very event-driven, while your code is actually executing. And there's a lot of fun examples on the web of where people's minds are just blown on how cheap things are. So Jeremy Lickness, who's one of our cloud developer advocates at Microsoft, wrote a blog post a little while ago talking about how he has his own service that he stood up, and he pays like 30 cents a month to run it, and it gets a reasonable amount of traffic because you're basically paying by the millisecond when you run Azure Functions. It's not just the fact that it's not polling all the time, but it's truly the platform's doing all of that stuff on your behalf, and you're actually only paying when your code is truly executing. The multiplier of milliseconds you run by the amount of memory you use.
That's right.
And I think you gave a couple canonical examples of what they're really good for. I think you said that they're really good for things that are triggered, so timers, processing things that come into my website that don't necessarily need an instantaneous response. A user uploads something, I can just store it in a queue or storage, and then I could let a function pick it up and process it, whether that means putting it in the database, whether that means like an image, right? I let people upload, I want to generate a thumbnail. Okay, great, I'm going to stick it in storage on the upload, a function will pick it up, it'll do the processing. That then gets it out of that virtual machine virtual machine that I'm paying for, so I'm not using CPU resources. I could be serving requests from customers to generate a thumbnail that happens on some other machine somewhere, and then it's just available to my application within probably milliseconds to a second or so, worst case scenario, that it can start using and serving that. So that also really improves the scalability of my application.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. You have to remember that it is another service, so as part of your architecture, you have to realize there's some delay, some latency, but the cool thing is that you could do things like batching. So you could do things like, well, I know this event gets fired very often, so I'm not going to react to it every time. I'm going to react every 10th time I get it. So yeah, lots of easy ways to make your architecture really efficient. And you can tweak that later on very easily.
Great. Very cool. So I'm going to come back to just this blog post. This is something I found that I just thought was fun. I always like it when people come up with really cool ways of doing things. So if you've dealt with ASP.NET Core, you're likely familiar with dependency injection. Dependency injection is the idea that you do registration, and then you take a thing of a particular type in your constructor, and the runtime takes care of injecting the correct object. Right? So this is a really makes your code very, very testable. Because what it allows you to do is it allows you, you typically register an interface, and then you can provide a different implementation at your test level than you can in production or in your code that's going to really run. It also enables you to change the behavior of your environment across different environments, which you talked about a little bit. So for example, the iConfiguration provider in ASP.NET Core lets you, you talked about it takes care of pulling the secrets from different places, whether it be secrets.json or environment variables or key vault, I can do any of those, but in my code where I get it, I just get an iConfiguration object, and it has whatever values the runtime's inserted there on my behalf. And so I saw this was a fun, so Azure Functions, you said are very functiony, and in .NET world, they're driven by attributes. I'm not going to kind of walk through his whole code. Obviously, you can see the blog URL here if anybody wants to go check it out. Or search for it on the internet, but I thought it was just a fun implementation of something doing. It's available via NuGet, and so Azure Functions are driven via attributes, and so he's added this attribute called inject, which means that you want to get this thing via dependency injection, and he has all the code to wire it up. So that was a fun example of somebody in the community doing augmenting and extending Azure functions in a very kind of cool, fun way.
Yeah.
Of course, the joke about dependency injection is the best way to obfuscate your code. But as I said, once you actually understand what's going on, it's a really, really nice way to program because it just, as I said, it makes your code so testable, makes your code so versatile as you move across environments or want to update or change behavior. One of the things I tend to demo a lot in some of the Azure talks we do is talking about, like, if you are accessing, so we talk about storage a lot, right? So in a web application, I might want to read and write stuff from some persistent store. And so by using dependency injection, it makes it very easy for me, if I was running my application on premises or on a virtual machine where I actually know I control the disk, to say, okay, I'm just going to use the local disk because that's all I need. And then say, okay, I want to move to more of I'm evolving my application, I want to move to more of a platform as a service, like Azure App Service. And so now I don't have to change any of my code that actually takes and tries to interact with my storage thing. I just write a new provider that might move over to Azure Storage, change the dependency injection registration, one line of code,
and you're done.
And boom, my code is behaving differently.
Yep. Oh, I love this kind of stuff. Do we have a little bit of time to geek out just a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
So it's been a while since I wrote any kind of production type code. My dev days are kind of in the past, but when IOC was all the rage, I remember my team wanted to combine IOC with mocking. So like you said, the classic pattern is you have some type of interface that you implement, and then if somebody wants to use you don't reference them. Instead, you pass yourself in the constructor, right? So that you can be used. Well, what we wanted to achieve is mocking. We wanted our mocked unit tests to not look like a bunch of code that just tries to create instances and pass them along. We want it to be just normal code that you would write as if the application was running without mocks. So what we did was we took the default container and we extended it. And we added a method that says, if somebody in the future asks you for this type, mock it. So you could write real code. You never had to deal with mocks unless you just, at the beginning of the test, you could say, well, here's what this method is going to test. Here are the mocks. And then the rest of the code was always just production style code. So yeah, I love these cool little hacks that make your code just look better.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example you gave, right? Think about testability. So in a function, let's say I upload some sort of document, and I want to persist that into a database.
Right.
When I'm running my unit tests, I don't necessarily want to persist that into a database.
No.
So so if I wrote the code here, like if I just wrote like reading and writing to the database on my own, the way to test that is to, like, basically I need a test database somewhere or to really do some like nasty interception of calls or things like that. Yeah. Where the idea of dependency injection is I could just have my test object that when I write my thing to the database, it just stores it as in a C# object, and then my test says, okay, is the C# object the right representation? And then my real code in production, it's just a different class that handles that, different implementation, and it's the one that actually writes it into the database rather than. So its testability is great from. So it's kind of easy to geek out on dependency injection, which is why this was a fun example of somebody doing something fun with Azure Functions. Yeah. So with that, I thought we would transition, given the time of where we are, right? We're finishing up our Visual Studio 2019 cycle. Preview 2 is available. And so I thought we'd take a little bit of time to show some of the new capabilities that we've added for both ASP.NET development and just Azure development in general. So I'm going to start real quick with 2 demos. Some of this stuff has likely been demoed on the ASP.NET community stand-up as well. But if you've missed it, it's definitely worth seeing. So the first thing I want to show is, we're already on my screen, is if you missed it, VS Code, great tool. We've added support for working with Razor files in VS Code. That was our top ask by far in our C# extension for VS Code is Razor support. So let's do .NET New. .NET New Razor. This will just create a Razor Pages file for me. Boom. Once it creates that. What this is going to do is it's going to give me a Razor Pages .NET Core project on my machine. Yep. And so while it's restoring, perfect. Let's just go ahead and then do code dot, and this should go ahead and open this folder. And And so now if I go into my pages file, so previously, anytime I was in a CS HTML file, a Razor file, I would only get IntelliSense or CSS support, but I wouldn't get any support for any of the C# IntelliSense. And so what I get now is if I want to write any C# code, I get that as well. So if I want to do like a for each, we have support for that now as well. Yes, I want to add these assets. That'll let it build and do the right thing. Let's go back here and add a new property. So let's just do a public string hello.net, get set. And now if I come back here, I should be able to so at model, and now I'm going to get actual real IntelliSense for that.
There you go.
So hello.net. So C# IntelliSense. So now we have full Razor support in the C# extension. It's worth mentioning that this is still in preview. 100% of Razor is not supported. The one thing that that I think the big thing that people have asked about for the most part is we don't have support for tag helpers yet. That's the one thing that's missing.
Okay.
But this is a fully open source, this portion of the extension, under the ASP.NET website. So if you have questions or issues or complaints, it's really easy to just go file issues or engage, and people are even welcome to give us pull requests and try to help us improve it and make it even better.
So we prefer GitHub issues over developer community on this one?
Yes. So
okay, cool.
for the VS Code extension, there's dedicated GitHub repo just for the Razor portions of this under the ASP.NET site. So we'd love feedback on that. Yeah. The other thing I want to show, and there's a couple comments in here about Visual Studio 2017. So Visual Studio 2019 is currently in preview.
Yep.
So it's not even RTW yet. But let me go ahead and close this. Let me go ahead and delete this. So let's go back to, and let's open that same project that we just did. So open project or solution. I think it's up here, TMP. Boom, let's open this CS proj file. And so in Visual Studio 2019, extending the theme of making Razor and CS/HTML development better, we have added support for refactoring and find all references across CS/HTML, which is something that we were always missing. So let's go back here and say what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the property that we just had there before. I'm going to say div, and I'm going to say at model.hello.net, right? So that's wrong thing, but okay, that's two of them.
Yep.
So now when I go here to my CS/HTML, a couple things. So first of all, when my code lens populates here in a couple seconds, I should be able to see, this is, no, this should be, there you go. It should show me that, give me a couple seconds. Shift F12. No references. Well, you know, these things are always fun on stage. It was, why is it not happy about that? Oh, because I forgot the dot. That's why nobody's referencing it. Turns out
there you go.
Model hello.net is not actually a valid thing.
So
now, this should update here in a second. If I say Shift F12, and I can actually see one reference.
Hey.
And so prior to Visual Studio 2019, we didn't understand when you were referencing code in Razor files. And so I can even close this, and you'll see that it'll actually keep that reference. So, yep, still there. And so it disappeared for a second. Excellent. And now the other, come back. The other thing that has always been a pain point when you're working with models in Razor is we didn't support refactoring across them. So if I renamed something in a model that I was passing through to my CS/HTML, then I wouldn't, it would be broken, right? I'd see a runtime error. And now, if I rename this, I'm going to say, hello, Standup. Boom. When I come back to index.chtml, you can see that the rename persisted through. So it's one of the new things coming for ASP.NET development in Visual Studio 2019. As mentioned, Preview 2 is currently out, and it's fully side-by-side install with Visual Studio 2017. So if you want to go try it out, it will not have any impact on your Visual Studio 2017 install.
We have done a lot of work to try and isolate the two. So yeah, hopefully you feel more confident installing previews and giving us some feedback early. Yeah.
Cool. So, Angelos, I think one of the things we talked about, you work on more of the Azure-specific tooling, and since this is a cloud-specific stand-up, or not cloud-specific, but cloud-themed stand-up, can you show me some of the new stuff that's coming from an Azure cloud perspective?
Yeah, so let's go over to my laptop this time. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here, the first iteration of this will apply to publishing to the cloud, but I'm also going to talk about our long-term plans, which is bringing this type of capability to all types of apps, no matter where they're deployed. But we just thought starting with Azure and App Service was a great starting point to get good feedback about the architecture before we go very broadly in terms of scenarios. Just to remind ourselves what publish looks like in Visual Studio 2017, what I have here is basically an empty ASP.NET Core application that I've created a publish profile for. So in case you haven't seen this before, you can right-click on an application and say publish. Then you get asked some questions, where do you want to publish it to? This is being published to App Service. And this is what we call the publish summary page, where you've set up the profile, and you can now continuously publish to this instance of App Service by pressing the publish button. I just wanted us to remember what the experience looks like in 2017, because I'm about to switch over to 2019.
Awesome.
So pay attention to some little things like the actions to create new and manage profiles. There's a little summary section here and some new stuff. I'm going to flip over now. So like you said, this is preview 2, not a final product. You will see some things that are not 100% ready yet. So this is Visual Studio 2019. This is the exact same published profile, actually looking at the exact same app service. But I'm going to point out some small UX improvements we've done, and then I'm going to talk about the main thing. So you'll notice that we have improved a little bit the UX around managing your profiles. So you can create a new one. You can edit the existing one, rename and delete it all from one place here. The summary section has some quality of life improvements, like some titles and the ability to change values in line. I'm going to go back. Well, it's not exactly in line, but there was no shortcut to get you to these values before. So we have done some cleanup and made things look a little bit better and work a little bit, discover functionality a little bit easier. But the main thing is this new section underneath called dependencies. And this is the first step towards the idea of Visual Studio understanding environments. I'm going to give you a quick demo of what we have already, but then I'm going to extrapolate from that and talk about the longer-term picture. So if you look at the previous version, after you had created your app service and after your application had been published, we didn't really help you create new instances of Azure services that you may want to use. You only got that opportunity at the very beginning when you created the profile. But when we talk to customers, we hear that people build things slowly and bit by bit. You start up with a web application. You first want to make sure that you can host it and it runs. Then you might add some dependency to it, like a storage account or a SQL database. Then as the application matures, you add more and more services. But we didn't really help you with the incremental maturity of your application. So the idea here is that publish profile won't just understand the target as in, okay, you're putting this in IIS or you're putting this in app service. It will also understand the dependencies the application has and how can they be fulfilled in each target environment. So starting with app service, we give you the ability to, after the fact, even after you've deployed your application, to create new instances of Azure Storage and Azure SQL. And in the future, this is going to be a kind of like a large catalog of services that you want to see, whatever is the most popular and people want to use. We will keep adding to this list. But the idea is that you can come into Visual Studio and tell it to an existing app service, please add a new Azure Storage account. So again, as I mentioned, this is a preview, so some things are not perfect, like the scroll bar you'll notice is not themed correctly, and we're showing validation messages before you do anything. Those are kind of the last-minute cleanup things we leave for the end, after we're kind of settled on the main experience. But what I want to point out here is, from a experience point of view, we made the implicit decision of show you this list of existing resources. I want to talk about that, and if people have feedback, I would love to get it too. But the idea was, we could present you with a choice of creating new or selecting existing at this point. But talking to customers, we realized that selecting existing is much more likely, and it probably serves more customers. We talked to some enterprise customers who said, well, I don't have the liberty or the authority to create new resources. I have to actually ask somebody else to do that. But then I can pick them and use them from then on. So we didn't want to default with an experience that it wasn't applicable to all of our customers. But what we also wanted to make sure is that nobody is blocked from creating new things when they know that's what they want to do. And instead they sit here waiting for this list. So you'll notice that we have a create new storage account right at the bottom of the list. And that is asynchronous from the list loading. Now, we're hurting ourselves in this demo because we also did some performance work, and this dialog is now coming up super fast. So I actually don't have a lot of opportunity to go and click this quickly. But I wanted to point out that that button doesn't need the list to be loaded. You don't have to wait. If you know you want to create a new storage account, you can just fire up the dialog and create a new storage account.
So I'm sure most people won't complain about it coming up too fast.
Yeah, I hope not. I mean, I am blown away by how quickly it does it. A bunch of people that saw it without being warned about it, they said, oh, you have a bug. That didn't read the data. And we're like, you did it, don't worry. It's great, I love it. So yeah, the reason why I'm showing you this is because, first of all, this is a design pattern we expect to use all over the place. So if there is feedback about it, if there is things that we've missed or use cases we can do better, please let us know. And I'm gonna ask something specific. We are planning on having these tables being sortable and things like that. Is there anything more we need to do?
Yeah, and so I think you mentioned earlier, but you mentioned developer community. So let's say I go download Visual Studio 2019 preview. I try this stuff out. I want to give us feedback. What is the best way to do that?
Yeah, so developer community is a place where customers can go and log issues, bugs, suggestions, anything that's on their mind. And this information comes directly to the product team.
Can you show me how to do it?
Sure, you can do it both from the product and the website. So
yeah, I was going to cheat and say just use the product.
Let's use the product. So I'm just going to close down this dialog. And it's called Report a Problem on the top right corner of Visual Studio. So in 2019, it's this icon here called Send Feedback. And after I click it, I get two options, Report a Problem or Suggest a Feature. Let me go back in 2017, and it's the same icon, just a slightly different location. It's at the top of the product. And you get the same options. So I'll go back to the latest. I'll say Suggest a Feature. And that gets you directly into the developer community section for Visual Studio. And then it's good to first search what you want to suggest in case somebody else has suggested it or something similar, because it really helps us to have one issue that the community puts their weight behind. It makes it much easier for us to say, look, a bunch of people are asking for this one item rather than, oh, we have a whole bunch of different items and they're probably related to the same thing. So it helps us, but it's not the end of the day.
The question for you online.
Yeah.
So they wanted to know the list of storage accounts that you brought up. You started from existing. They
Yes.
wanted to know if it is filterable or sortable if there's a long list. Like you obviously had a
Yes.
large list there.
So this is great. That's exactly the kind of conversation I want to have. We are definitely having it sortable. Yes, you can sort by all the different columns. The current control doesn't draw the sort order. Usually there's a little triangle that tells you this column is sorted. So that's just a little bug for preview that we're gonna fix. On top of that, at the top of the table, we have a subscription picker. Well, it's more like a filter because you're not picking the subscription. You're just basically filtering the table below to that subscription. So that also is there. But I would love to know if there's another pivot or some other type of filtering or sorting that people would find helpful. And I would love to hear about that.
Great, thanks. So this is mostly, I think, what you and I had prepared. Obviously, it's supposed to be relatively community, relatively informal. Any other questions on the chat before we wrap up?
I just want to mention in closing that the reason why I said earlier that the Key Vault thing, you stole a bit of my example. Here's what I wanted to say. I wanted to say that the reason why we think it's a good idea to enable Visual Studio to understand environments more than just a target is this. We talked about Key Vault and how some people may want to use it only in production, Maybe some people want to use it in some sort of pre-production and testing system. Some people maybe even want to use it during F5. But that's a choice. So a perfectly valid configuration is for local F5 to use user secrets, just like you said, which is what it's designed for, and for a shared environment or production to use Key Vault, which is great. That's a great pattern. And Visual Studio helps you add Key Vault capabilities to your code. But it doesn't have the concept of an environment yet, so it can't help you to add Key Vault to a particular environment. So we're trying to build the capability in Visual Studio to understand the context of environments, so then it can help you in more specific and targeted ways. And if people have thoughts and feedback on that, I'd also love to get some of that.
Great, maybe we can talk about that more next time.
Well, we definitely will, because we have lots of work on this to do.
Great. I don't see any more questions, other than there was one question about why was the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up not on 2 days ago? I think it's because everybody that normally would do it is currently at the NDC London conference.
We didn't get to go.
So, yeah, they didn't invite us. So, anyways, thank you, everybody. Yeah. We appreciate it. We'd love your feedback. Comment section, Twitch. We'd love to know what you're interested in hearing about from more of a web and cloud perspective from a .NET Community Stand-Up. Thank you.